Okay, so we're going to start 2.2 by talking about composite functions. So when we're speaking of composite functions, they will be written in one of two notations. The second notation, the FOG, which is pronounced F, both of them are read F of G of X. The bottom one is more common within IB notation, but the top one is more common within SAT and ACT. So I'll introduce you to both, but it's pretty straightforward. Basically, what this is saying is normally, since there would be an x in the parentheses for f of x, like f parentheses x parentheses, this means you're plugging in g of x anywhere you see an x. So for example, if I have f of x equals 7x plus 2, and g of x is equal to 2x, then I will just plug in a 2x everywhere I see an x in this equation. So I would have 7 times 2x plus 2, which would be equal to 14x plus 2. And it's that easy. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the IB problems and see if we can figure those out. So this first one here is a calculator question, so you can use your calculator, which makes it a little bit nicer, but for part B, you don't need your calculator. So since it's written g of f of x, it means that we are putting, it always helps me to write it in the other notation. This would be the same thing as g of f of x, which means I'm putting in the equation of f of x into g of x everywhere I see an x. So I would rewrite g of x, and then instead of the x, I have x cubed and minus 1. Just continue the function like normal. So to simplify this, you really don't have to, but it's 2x cubed minus 1. Okay, so then it asks us to solve the equation for where this would be equal to 0. So in order to do that, I just set this equal to 0. You can either find the 0 in your calculator, or you can solve the, put both equations into y1 and y2 and find the intersect. You can look at the table and see if you can just find it, or you can solve it by hand. So go ahead and pause your video and do that now. Okay, so I went ahead and did this one by hand. You can check your work here. If you did it in your calculator, you can just type in my answer and see that your decimals are correct. I typically leave my answers in this form as long as they are as simplified as they can be, because that's considered an exact value and I don't have to worry about rounding my answer for IB's sake. Okay, moving on to the next example question. The first part A is just asking you to find f of 3, which is where you plug in 3. So you can pause your video and do that now. Okay, so now you should have gotten 11 for that one. And when they say g of f of 3, you have two ways to go about this. You can either plug in the whole equation, or I can rewrite this. This is the same thing as g of f of 3. And since I already know what f of 3 is, I just found that, this is the same thing as saying g of 11. So I can just plug in 11 into g, and I get 11 minus 3, which is 8. Or you could have figured out what g of f is and shown that that would be x squared plus 2 minus 3, which is the same thing as x squared plus, x squared minus 1. And then if you had x squared minus 1 and you plugged in 3, you would get 9 minus 1 equals 8. And both answers were 8. So either method works, it's just whichever you think is faster. Considering what they asked you to do in part A, I would assume that the fastest way and the way they want you to do it is this, but either way would work. All right, moving on to the next example, which is now moving into inverse functions. So the most basic way to think of inverse functions is you're going to swap your x and y and solve for y, or consider that f of y equals x, which means you plug in y for everywhere there is an x. It's just another way of notating it. So if we're looking at if we're looking for g inverse, we're going to look at g of x. And I'm going to switch this out. I'm going to have x is equal to 2y minus 1. So then I would have 2y equals x plus 1. And then y is equal to x plus 1 over 2. That's it. It's that simple. Okay, so moving on to the next one. This next one is no calculator. This one combines a couple of the skills. Just go ahead and do parts B and C. Don't worry about A. So go ahead and pause your video and solve those now. Okay, so these are the answers you should have gotten. The first one, you just plug in g of x for everywhere you see an x in the function f of x. And then for the inverse, you just swap x and y, solve for y, and you should have gotten x plus 3 divided by 8. Moving on to the next one, again, should be pretty straightforward. Go ahead and try it on your own, and then come back and check your answer. Okay, again, so I just swapped my x and y and solved for y. The inverse would then be x squared plus 3. Okay, lastly, we're going to look at composites and inverses in terms of tables. So you can go ahead and take a look at this example. So the first thing is finding the value of f of 2, which means what is f when I plug in 2. So I'm going to find the function of f and trace it over to when I plug in 2. And then I get that the answer is 0. So the answer for part A is 0. Okay, as far as part B, it says find g of f of 2, which remembers is when you have g and then f of 2. Okay, so I know that f of 2 is 0, so I'm going to find g and find 0, and when I find them together, it is -1. And then lastly, it wants you to find g inverse of 5, which means I'm going to find g and find 5 in that row, and here it is right at the beginning, and then trace it up to figure out which x value I put in. So the inverse would be -4. And that is that. So I will see you tomorrow in class in order to see if y'all have any questions about this, and otherwise be working on your Delta Math.